Did you just correct my fingering? Her voice cut through the mahogany-paneled music room like a cold steel blade. Elijah Brooks froze, his left hand still hovering above hers, just inches from the grand piano keys. Isabel Whitestone stared at him, spine straight as a bowstring, lips tightly pressed, her pale blue eyes flashing with a chill that could make winter jealous. She was the embodiment of elegance forged into steel, her silk blouse impeccably pressed, her posture flawless, the kind of woman who had long since traded warmth for control. Elijah slowly withdrew his hand and rested it on his lap. "I did," he said calmly, "only because that passage needs grace, and you were playing it like you were leading an army." A tense silence followed. Then Isabel shut the piano lid with one firm motion. "This lesson is over." He stood up, gave a single nod, and walked out, just like that. Only 3 hours earlier, Elijah had been making scrambled eggs for his daughter Naomi in their tiny kitchen on East 15th Street, Oakland. The old skillet sizzled while sunlight slipped through the cracked blinds. Their home was small, but it overflowed with laughter, old books, and sheet music taped to the fridge. "Dad, do I really have to wear dress shoes?" Naomi groaned between bites. "I play better in socks." "You eat better in socks, too," he teased, "but Miss Hawthorne wants formality for recitals." "So, shoes it is." Naomi grinned, showing off a missing tooth. "Bet I'll still hit the high C better than her star student." "You always do." Then the phone rang. An unknown number. He almost let it go to voicemail, but something made him answer. The voice on the other end was cold, professional. "Mr. Brooks, I'm calling on behalf of Ms. Whitestone. She's looking for private piano instruction. She's particular, but the compensation is generous." He hesitated. "Whitestone, as in Whitestone Capital?" "Yes. The first session is today, if you're interested." He was. When he arrived at the gated estate, it felt like stepping onto another planet. Stone fountains, limestone pillars, and a white grand piano set beneath soaring cathedral windows. The butler barely looked at him. Elijah was guided through the house like hired help. Then she entered. Isabel Whitestone, just past 40, pale as porcelain, already a legend for turning a modest investment firm into a Wall Street powerhouse. Her name was synonymous with precision, ruthless in boardrooms, unshakable in interviews, and now a beginner with Beethoven. She didn't shake his hand. "Let's get this over with," she said flatly. He nodded, keeping his tone even. "Let's start with some scales." The mistake, he later realized, was touching her hand. Not romantically, not intrusively, just a gentle adjustment of her finger to prevent wrist strain. But to Isabel, that moment broke something deeper. Not because of pride, but because, somewhere, in her story, touch had never come without a price. That night, while washing dishes, Elijah kept replaying the moment in his head. Naomi sat cross-legged on the floor, doodling music notes on scraps of paper. "She hated you?" Naomi asked. He chuckled. "She didn't love me." "Then you should quit." He paused. "Maybe." But what lingered wasn't Isabel's anger. It was her hesitation. The way she paused before closing the piano. The way her eyes softened, just briefly, when he played. "She didn't hate the music," he said quietly. Naomi looked up. "Then maybe she needs more of it." The next morning, Elijah drove to the cemetery. It wasn't his usual visit day, but he needed the voice he used to hear most clearly. He stood at the grave of his late wife, Monique, and whispered, "She played like a soldier, but I think there's still a song in her somewhere." The wind shifted. A single dry leaf drifted across the headstone. Monique used to call that a sign. Elijah closed his eyes and smiled. He got back in the car and called the number again. "Tell Ms. Whitestone I'll return for one more lesson. This time, I won't fix her hands. I'll fix the silence." Elijah returned to the Whitestone estate under gray skies and guarded expectations. Isabel greeted him in the music room without expression, her posture rigid, eyes unreadable. "Let's try again," she said simply. No apology, no warmth, just permission to begin. He took it. For several lessons, tension hung between them, like an unplayed chord. She followed his instructions mechanically, avoided eye contact, spoke only when necessary. But Elijah, a man who'd spent years tuning both instruments and people, noticed subtle shifts. Her fingers stopped trembling on the keys. Her breathing steadied during difficult passages. She was beginning to listen, not just to him, but to the music. On the fourth lesson, Naomi unexpectedly tagged along, curled up quietly with a sketch pad in the corner. Isabel tried to object, but Naomi's presence brought a strange gentleness into the room. "You play better when she's here," Elijah noted after Isabel completed a difficult etude. She looked away. "She reminds me of someone I never got to be." That night, Elijah sat in bed, unable to sleep. He thought of Naomi's smile, Isabel's rare softness, and the strange ache in his chest he couldn't quite name. He was getting involved, not romantically, not yet, but emotionally, and that was dangerous. As weeks passed, rumors began to stir. A financial blog published a grainy photo of Isabel and Elijah exiting a music store. "CEO mentored by mystery man," the headline read. It went viral. At the next board meeting, Isabel was ambushed by subtle jabs from investors. "We'd hate to see your leadership compromised by distractions," said one, smirking. She said nothing, but Elijah noticed her grip tighten on the piano bench the next lesson. "You want to stop?" he asked. "Do you?" she replied. "Because I don't." That silence between them changed. It wasn't just resistance anymore. It was defiance. Isabel began opening up, not in speeches, but in fragments. She'd once been a foster child, adopted at 9 by Franklin Whitestone, groomed for corporate legacy like a thoroughbred. "Feelings were liabilities," she said during a slow waltz. "Smiles were signs of weakness. I learned to replace emotion with precision." Elijah, eyes still on the keys, murmured, "And yet you chose piano." She gave a half smile. "Maybe I got tired of being predictable." But not everyone wanted her to change. Braden Cole, senior vice president of finance, launched a whisper campaign. "She's letting a former janitor teach her how to lead." What's next? Jazz in the boardroom? The board grew restless. A major client threatened to pull out. The pressure mounted. Isabel was summoned to a private shareholder session. When she walked into the music room afterward, she looked exhausted, but not broken. "They want me to either terminate your contract or step back from the firm. Apparently, I can't have both." Elijah's heart sank. "And what do you want?" She looked at him for a long moment. "I want to finish what we started." The next lesson was different. She played not for correctness, but connection. Elijah watched, stunned, as her fingers danced, not perfectly, but beautifully. At the end, she whispered, "I don't want to go back to who I was." He replied, "Then don't." That night, as a storm rolled in, Isabel sent him a recording, a simple melody she had composed herself. The subject line read, "To the one who taught me how to feel." Elijah sat in his car, listening on repeat, heart pounding. But the next morning, the front page of the street report featured a leaked clip. Isabel playing piano with a black man behind her, smiling. The backlash was immediate. Corporate circles lit up with speculation. The board scheduled an emergency vote. The final lesson began with Isabel arriving in silence. "It's tonight," she said. "They'll decide whether I'm still fit to lead." Elijah placed a hand over hers. "Then play like it's your last chance to be heard." She did. She played until her hands trembled, until tears streaked her cheeks, until even the silence afterward felt like music. And when she stood before the board that evening, she didn't flinch. "I'm not stepping down," she said. "If leading with humanity is a flaw, then I welcome it. And if you believe this firm is stronger without me, vote now." No one raised a hand. As she walked out of that room, the world finally heard not the CEO's strategy, but the woman's song. Isabel won the boardroom, but lost something far more personal in the process. In the days following the emergency vote, she canceled 2 lessons without explanation. When Elijah finally received her text, "Needs space. Thank you for everything," his heart sank with a weight he didn't know he still carried. He stared at the screen in silence while Naomi practiced scales in the background, unaware that the song they had begun together was unraveling. That night, Elijah found himself wandering the grocery aisles, distracted, picking up items he didn't need. His mind kept circling the same question. Had he crossed a line he never should have approached? Was the woman who had shown him vulnerability retreating behind the armor again? Naomi noticed first. At dinner, she asked quietly, "Are you sad because of her?" Elijah paused mid-bite. "I think I'm sad because I walked away before I knew if she wanted me to stay." Naomi reached across the table, her tiny hand steady. "You always tell me that music is how we speak when words don't work. So maybe it's time you listen again." That night, Elijah opened his inbox. A single email from Isabel waited. No subject line, no message, just an attachment, an audio file titled "Nocturne for Naomi." He clicked play. It was her, imperfect but raw, pouring every unsaid word into the keys. He closed his eyes listening, and then he wept. The next morning, Elijah drove to the Whitestone estate through a haze of cold air and clearer resolve. He wasn't sure if he'd be welcomed, but he knew he had to try. The butler opened the door without a word. Isabel was at the piano, back to him, playing the same piece. When she saw him in the reflection of the window, her hands paused, but didn't leave the keys. "I didn't know how to ask you to come back," she said, voice low, almost unsure. "Then don't ask," Elijah replied. "Just let me stay." She turned to face him, her expression stripped of every shield. "I'm scared." "Me too." They stood in silence, then stepped closer, not in passion, but in peace. She reached for his hand. He didn't hesitate. Weeks passed. The press eventually moved on. The whispers in corporate halls died down. What remained was something quieter, stronger. Elijah didn't just resume teaching. He and Isabel launched a foundation for community music programs, starting in East Oakland. Naomi became its unofficial mascot, charming donors and teaching younger kids their first scales. One afternoon, at the program's opening recital, Naomi took the stage in a sky blue dress and played "Nocturne for Naomi" before a full crowd. In the front row, Isabel gripped Elijah's hand, not out of fear, but out of grounding. After the applause, Elijah turned to her. "Still scared?" She shook her head, tears in her eyes. "Not anymore." The camera panned out slowly, the piano still echoing in the air, as 2 souls, once strangers across lines of race, class, and grief, now stood side by side. Not perfect, not fairy tale, but real, and deeply, defiantly whole. 3 years later, the Whitestone Community Arts Center stood proudly between a thrift store and a bakery in a sun-worn corner of East Oakland. It wasn't glass and steel like the buildings Isabel had once conquered, but brick, warm paint, and second-hand rugs that softened every footstep. Inside, children's laughter spilled down the halls over the worn ivory of upright pianos, across canvases half-finished with neon colors. Elijah had become more than a teacher. He was a father to many, a voice that told forgotten kids, "You matter." Isabel visited less now, not because she cared less, but because she finally trusted that goodness didn't need to be micromanaged. She served quietly on the board, showing up at just the right moments, with a knowing glance, a wordless squeeze of Elijah's shoulder, or a surprise box of new sheet music for Naomi's students. They didn't live together. They didn't wear rings, but they belonged, undeniably, unapologetically, to each other. One afternoon, Elijah found Naomi sitting alone at the front piano, frowning over a blank sheet. "Stuck?" he asked. She nodded. "I want to write something real, something that feels like us." He smiled. "Then don't write for people. Write for silence. Write for the moment before the applause." She blinked, then scribbled something on the top corner of the page. "The Quiet Between Notes." That became the name of her first full composition. It was performed a year later at a regional showcase. When Naomi bowed, the applause was thunderous, but her eyes searched only for two faces. Elijah, standing in the wings, hand over heart. Isabel, seated in the center row, smiling not like a CEO, but like a woman who had learned that vulnerability was not weakness, but arrival. After the concert, a young girl approached Naomi with wide eyes. "I didn't know music could feel like that," she whispered. Naomi grinned. "That's because you haven't heard your own song yet." Outside, the night air was soft with spring. Elijah and Isabel walked together down the quiet sidewalk. No need for words. Behind them, the warm yellow lights of the center glowed like a promise kept. As they reached the corner, Elijah paused. "Do you think," he asked, "any of this would have happened if I hadn't touched your hand that first day?" Isabel looked at him, lips curving slightly. "Probably not. But I'm glad you did," he chuckled. "You fired me, remember?" She smirked. "And yet somehow you never left." They stood there a moment longer. Then, hand in hand, they turned and disappeared into the stillness, leaving behind a legacy not of power, but of quiet, resilient love. It wasn't the music that lasted. It was the silence after it ended. Years had passed, yet Elijah still remembered the exact moment the silence in Isabel began to shift. Not explode, not unravel, just soften, like the final note of a lullaby, held long enough to still a storm. They never spoke in dramatic declarations. No need. Their lives had become layered in quieter things. Morning coffee left steaming on a piano bench. Naomi's laughter echoing from a practice room. A glance across a crowded auditorium that said, "I'm here." Still. Sometimes, Isabel would visit the community center and stay for hours without saying a word. She'd sit at the back, watching children with cheap violins and cracked keyboards create something she had once believed was reserved for the privileged. And every so often, when no one was looking, she'd press her fingers gently to the edge of a piano and play a single note, like checking if she still existed in sound. One evening, After a particularly long fundraiser, Elijah walked Isabel to her car. The city around them buzzed, but they were quiet. She unlocked the door, then hesitated. "Do you ever wonder if we were meant to meet?" He tilted his head. I think we were meant to listen." She nodded. "And what if we hadn't?" Elijah looked up at the streetlight above them. "Then maybe you'd still be running from silence, and I'd still be hiding inside it." Isabel smiled softly, not the practiced kind she used at press conferences, but the unguarded kind that came only after surviving yourself. Before stepping into the car, she reached out and slipped a small folded paper into his hand. "Open it when you get home." He watched her drive off, headlights fading into the night like the closing bars of a long song. Later, in his quiet kitchen, Elijah unfolded the note. It was sheet music, handwritten, untitled. At the bottom corner were 4 words in simple ink. "You were my melody." He stood there for a long time, one hand resting over his chest, not moving, not needing to, because some stories don't end. They echo. It was the sound of wood creaking that brought Elijah back. Not thunder, not applause. Just the soft groan of the old floorboard beneath the piano bench. Familiar, grounding. Naomi had grown now, 17, graceful, a scholar of music and life. That morning she sat before the baby grand in their modest but warm home studio, eyes closed, hands hovering over the keys. Isabel stood in the doorway, quiet, unannounced, letting the sunlight trace the silver in her hair. She rarely stayed long these days. Her health had begun to falter, not enough to speak of, but enough to feel. Yet this morning she came, not as a CEO, not even as a partner, just as someone who wanted to listen one last time. Naomi began to play. The piece was her own, a blend of all the melodies Elijah had taught her, and the silences Isabel had shown her how to embrace. It moved like memory, gentle, aching, resilient. Elijah stood behind them both, arms crossed, eyes glistening but firm. As the final note faded into the walls, Naomi looked up. "Did I do it right?" she asked. Isabel approached, rested her hand on Naomi's shoulder, and whispered, "You did it honestly. That's better than right." Later that evening, the 3 of them shared tea on the porch, the piano room behind them, now still and golden. Fireflies blinked like lazy Morse code across the yard. Isabel leaned back in her chair, eyes scanning the horizon. "Funny," she said. "I spent half my life chasing silence, and the other half learning to sit inside it." Elijah reached for her hand, not out of impulse, but instinct. "You turned silence into a home," he said, "and filled it with music." Naomi rested her head against Isabel's shoulder. The stars began to show. Before heading to bed, Elijah passed by the piano once more. He opened the lid, ran his fingers lightly over the keys, but didn't play. Instead, he placed the folded sheet music from years ago, Nocturne for Naomi, onto the stand and closed the lid gently over it. No need to perform, no need to prove, just a quiet offering, left in the room that had once held a cold CEO, a grieving father, and a child learning to dream. In that moment, the past didn't feel like a weight. It felt like a harmony, not the kind you hear, the kind you live through,